Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the construction site, her weathered hands gripping the safety helmet that had become as familiar to her as the tactical gear she once wore in the Middle East. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt and concrete, but it was the snickers and whispers from the group of male workers that truly darkened her mood. At 34, she had traded her Navy SEAL uniform for work boots and a tool belt, hoping to find purpose in building structures instead of dismantling terrorist strongholds. The transition from military to civilian life had been rougher than any mission she had ever undertaken. After 8 years of service, including 3 deployments in Afghanistan and 2 classified operations that she could never discuss, Sarah found herself struggling to fit into a world that seemed to question her every move. The construction company had hired her based on her engineering background and leadership experience, but the crew of 20-something men seemed determined to make her life miserable. "Hey, Mitchell!" called out Jake Henderson, the unofficial leader of the group and the most vocal of her critics. His voice carried across the site with a mocking tone that made Sarah's jaw clench. "You sure you can handle lifting those steel beams today? Maybe you should stick to holding the measuring tape." Sarah had heard variations of this comment for the past 3 weeks since starting the job. Each time, she bit back the responses that came naturally to her, the sharp retorts that would have shut down any subordinate who dared question her capabilities during her military service. But this was different. Here, she was just another worker, and creating conflict would only make her situation worse. "I'll manage just fine," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect from Marines twice her size. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, and she was prepared to prove herself through work rather than arguments. The project they were working on was a new community center in downtown Phoenix, a 3-story building that would serve underprivileged families in the area. Sarah found meaning in the work, knowing that her efforts would create a space where children could learn and grow safely. It reminded her of the schools she had helped protect overseas, the reason she had joined the military in the first place. Marcus Rodriguez, the site foreman and a Marine veteran himself, watched the interaction from his trailer office. He had seen Sarah's military record during the hiring process and knew exactly who he was dealing with. The woman had more combat experience than most of his crew combined, but he also understood the delicate balance required to maintain order on a construction site. He made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the situation. As the morning progressed, Sarah threw herself into her work with the same intensity she had brought to every mission. She operated the crane with precision, moved materials with efficiency, and solved problems with the quick thinking that had kept her team alive in hostile territory. But no matter how well she performed, the comments continued. "Look at her trying so hard," whispered Tony Vasquez to his partner as they watched Sarah coordinate the placement of a massive concrete panel. "Acting like she's some kind of superhero." The other workers had formed an informal alliance against her, not necessarily out of malice, but from a combination of insecurity and traditional thinking that questioned whether a woman belonged on their crew. Most of them were good men with families to support, but they had never worked alongside someone like Sarah, and their discomfort manifested as casual cruelty. During lunch break, Sarah sat alone at a makeshift table made from plywood and sawhorses, eating a simple sandwich while reviewing the afternoon's blueprints. The isolation didn't bother her as much as it should have. She had spent countless hours alone in observation posts and safe houses, learning to find peace in solitude. What troubled her was the waste of potential, the knowledge that this crew could accomplish so much more if they worked as a true team. "You know what your problem is?" Jake said, approaching her table with his own lunch. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, which somehow made his words more cutting. "You're trying too hard to be one of the guys. Maybe if you accepted that you're different, things would go easier for everyone." Sarah looked up from her blueprints, studying Jake's face for a moment before responding. She saw a young man, probably 26 or 27, with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent in manual labor. There was no real hatred in his eyes, just a kind of casual dismissal that she had encountered countless times before. "I'm not trying to be one of the guys," she said quietly. "I'm trying to do my job well, same as everyone else here." "Right. But maybe your job should be something more suitable. You know, something that doesn't require so much physical strength." Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same anger that had fueled her through Bud's training when instructors had tried to break her spirit. But she had learned to control that fire, to channel it into determination rather than destruction. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice remaining level despite the storm brewing inside her. "But I think I can handle myself." Jake shrugged and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her sandwich. She knew that tomorrow would bring more of the same challenges, more questions about her abilities, more subtle attempts to undermine her confidence. But she also knew something that Jake and his friends didn't yet understand. She had faced down terrorists in caves, survived explosions that killed her teammates, and earned her place among the most elite warriors in the world. A construction site was just another battlefield, and Sarah Mitchell had never lost a fight that truly mattered. She just hadn't decided yet whether this one was worth winning, or if she should find somewhere else to rebuild her life. The decision, she knew, would come soon enough. As the afternoon sun beat down on the construction site, Sarah returned to her work with renewed focus. She had 3 hours left in her shift, and she intended to make them count. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through 8 years of military service. The real test, she sensed, was still coming. The incident that would change everything began on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the Phoenix heat was finally starting to break. Sarah arrived at the construction site 30 minutes early, as was her habit, to review the day's plans and ensure all equipment was properly maintained. She had always believed that preparation prevented poor performance, a lesson hammered into her during countless military briefings. The crew was scheduled to install the building's main support structure, a complex operation requiring precise coordination and absolute attention to safety protocols. Sarah had volunteered to lead the rigging operation, knowing that her experience with heavy machinery and tactical planning made her the most qualified person for the job. Marcus had agreed, despite knowing it would likely increase tension among the other workers. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered, when Marcus announced the day's assignments. "She's going to get someone killed trying to prove how tough she is." Sarah pretended not to hear the comment, but inside she felt the familiar weight of having to prove herself yet again. Every day on this site felt like a new trial, a constant test of her patience and professionalism. She had started keeping a mental count of the dismissive comments, the eye rolls, and the deliberate attempts to exclude her from conversations. The number was approaching triple digits. The morning progressed smoothly as Sarah directed the crane operations with military precision. She communicated clearly with the operator, guided the massive steel beams into position with hand signals that were crisp and unmistakable, and double-checked every connection point before giving approval to proceed. Her movements were economical and confident, betraying no hint of uncertainty or hesitation. "I hate to admit it, but she knows what she's doing," Tony whispered to another worker as they watched Sarah guide a 2-ton beam into its mounting brackets with millimeter accuracy. "Probably learned it in the military," his partner replied, "but this isn't the Army. Things work different here." As lunchtime approached, the crew had successfully installed 6 of the 8 main support beams. They were ahead of schedule and hadn't encountered a single safety issue, a fact that should have impressed everyone involved. Instead, Sarah noticed an increase in the hostile undercurrent that had plagued her since her first day. The breaking point came when she overheard Jake talking to a group of workers near the equipment shed. His voice was deliberately loud enough for her to hear, a calculated attempt to provoke a reaction. "I'm telling you guys, having her here is a liability. What happens when we need someone to haul ass in an emergency? What happens when things get really tough and she can't keep up? We're all going to suffer because management wanted to make some kind of political statement." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a cold determination that she recognized from her most dangerous missions. She had reached the point where backing down was no longer an option. The time had come to show these men exactly who they were dealing with. She walked deliberately toward the group, her stride carrying the unconscious confidence of someone who had faced down armed insurgents in foreign countries. The conversation died as she approached, and she could see uncertainty flickering in Jake's eyes despite his bravado. "Jake, I need to talk to you," she said calmly. "Privately." "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Fine," Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational despite the electricity in the air. "I've been listening to your concerns about my capabilities for 3 weeks now. I think it's time we settled this question once and for all." The other workers exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Marcus noticed the gathering from his office window and started walking toward them, his instincts warning him that the situation was about to escalate. "What are you proposing?" Jake asked, trying to maintain his air of casual dismissal. Sarah smiled, but there was something predatory in the expression that made several of the men take an unconscious step backward. "You seem to think I can't handle the physical demands of this job. You've questioned my strength, my endurance, and my ability to perform under pressure. So let's test it." She gestured toward a pile of steel beams that needed to be moved to the other side of the site, each one weighing approximately 150 pounds and requiring 2 men to carry safely. "You and your buddy Tony there can work as a team. I'll work alone. We'll see who can move more beams in 30 minutes. "That's insane," Tony protested. "Those beams require 2 people for safety reasons. You could seriously hurt yourself." "I appreciate your concern for my safety," Sarah replied, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. "But I'm willing to take that risk if you are. Unless, of course, you're not confident in your abilities." Jake found himself trapped by his own rhetoric. For weeks, he had been proclaiming that Sarah didn't belong on the construction site because she couldn't match the physical capabilities of the male workers. Now she was offering to prove him wrong, and backing down would undermine everything he had said. "This is stupid," Marcus said as he reached the group. "Nobody's moving steel beams alone. It's against safety regulations, and I'm not having anyone get hurt over some ridiculous competition." But Sarah had already made her decision. Without waiting for further discussion, she walked to the pile of beams and hefted one onto her shoulder with a fluid motion that spoke of countless hours spent in military fitness training. The beam, which normally required 2 men to manage safely, seemed almost weightless in her hands. The entire construction crew stopped what they were doing to watch as Sarah began moving the steel beams with a combination of strength, technique, and sheer determination that left everyone speechless. She didn't just carry them. She carried them with a precision and efficiency that made the task look almost effortless. By the time Marcus could organize a response, Sarah had moved 4 beams to their required positions. Her breathing was controlled, her movements economical, and her face showed no sign of strain or fatigue. She had found her rhythm, the same mental state that had carried her through the most grueling aspects of SEAL training. Jake and Tony, meanwhile, were struggling to keep pace despite working as a team. The sight of Sarah outperforming both of them simultaneously was creating a cognitive dissonance that none of the workers knew how to process. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. "Enough!" Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. This ends right now. Sarah, put down that beam before you get yourself killed. Everyone else, back to work. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. She had something more to prove, not just to Jake and his friends, but to herself. For 3 weeks, she had endured their dismissal and disrespect, telling herself that patience and professionalism would eventually win them over. Now she realized that some lessons could only be taught through direct demonstration. The confrontation was far from over, and Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. The moment that would forever change the dynamics of the construction site came at exactly 2:47 p.m., when the afternoon shift was in full swing and everyone had returned to their assigned tasks. Sarah had complied with Marcus's order to stop the beam-moving demonstration, but the tension in the air remained thick enough to cut with a welding torch. Jake and his supporters were huddled near the concrete mixer, their voices low but their gestures animated as they processed what they had just witnessed. The easy dismissal they had maintained for weeks was beginning to crack, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps they had misjudged their female co-worker. "She's stronger than I thought," Tony admitted reluctantly. "But strength isn't everything. This job requires experience, intuition, things you can't learn in the military." Sarah, meanwhile, had returned to her assigned station operating the crane, her movements as precise and controlled as always, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. She had made her point about physical capabilities, but she knew the real test was yet to come. In her military experience, respect was earned through performance under pressure, not through demonstrations during breaks. The test came sooner than anyone expected. At 3:15 p.m., a sharp crack echoed across the construction site, followed by a grinding screech that made everyone's blood run cold. One of the temporary support cables holding a massive concrete panel had snapped under stress, leaving the 2-ton slab hanging at a dangerous angle directly above where 3 workers were installing electrical conduits. "Move! Everybody move!" Marcus shouted, but the workers below were trapped in a narrow space between concrete walls, with no clear escape route as the panel swayed ominously overhead. Time slowed to a crawl as Sarah assessed the situation with the tactical mindset that had been drilled into her through years of crisis training. The remaining support cables were stretched beyond their limits and would fail within minutes, possibly seconds. The crane she was operating was positioned at the wrong angle to provide immediate assistance, and the workers below were frozen in panic. Without hesitation, Sarah abandoned her crane controls and sprinted toward the emergency release controls for the backup support system, a complex mechanism that could stabilize the falling panel if activated correctly. But reaching the controls required climbing a 30-foot scaffolding structure that was shaking violently from the stress of the failing support system. "Sarah, don't!" Marcus yelled. "It's too dangerous. Wait for the emergency crew." But Sarah was already scaling the scaffolding with the fluid grace of someone who had rappelled from helicopters under enemy fire. Her movements were swift and sure, each handhold and footstep calculated to minimize risk while maximizing speed. The workers below could only watch in amazement as she climbed toward what appeared to be certain death. Jake found himself holding his breath as he watched the woman he had spent weeks dismissing risk her life to save his co-workers. "Come on," he whispered, surprising himself with the intensity of his concern. "Come on, make it." Sarah reached the control platform just as another support cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The concrete panel lurched another few degrees, and chunks of debris rained down on the workers below. She could hear their panicked voices, could see the terror in their eyes as they realized how close they were to being crushed. Her hands flew over the emergency controls with practiced efficiency, activating the backup hydraulic system that would deploy emergency supports to catch the falling panel. But the system was manual, requiring precise timing and physical strength to operate the emergency winch that would position the supports correctly. The winch handle required 200 pounds of force to operate, and it had to be turned continuously for 90 seconds to fully deploy the emergency supports. Sarah gripped the handle and began turning, her muscles straining against the massive resistance as sweat poured down her face. Below, the construction crew watched in stunned silence as their female colleague fought to save lives with the same intensity and focus that had once made her one of the military's elite warriors. Every rotation of the winch handle was a battle, every second a test of will and determination. "She's doing it," Tony breathed, unable to keep the admiration out of his voice. "She's actually doing it." At the 60-second mark, Sarah's arms began to shake from the strain. But she didn't slow down. She had endured worse during Hell Week, had pushed her body beyond its limits in situations where failure meant death. This was just another test, another mountain to climb. As the emergency supports locked into position with a satisfying clang, the immediate danger passed. The concrete panel was secure, the workers below were safe, and Sarah had proven once and for all that she belonged on this construction site. She climbed down from the scaffolding to find the entire crew waiting for her, their faces showing a mixture of respect, gratitude, and shame. Jake stepped forward first, his usual swagger replaced by genuine humility. "Sarah, he began, then stopped, struggling to find words adequate for the moment. "I owe you an apology. We all do. What you just did, saving those guys, that was incredible." Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw the same men who had questioned her abilities, dismissed her contributions, and made her feel unwelcome for 3 long weeks. But now she also saw something else: recognition, respect, and the beginning of genuine acceptance. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Same reason I did everything else in the military, same reason I show up here every day and do my job the best way I know how." Marcus approached with the emergency response team, who had arrived to assess the damage and ensure the site was safe to continue operations. As they worked, he pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish," he said with a slight smile. "Probably both, but you saved 3 lives today and everyone here knows it." "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, but Marcus could see the satisfaction in her eyes. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere on the construction site underwent a complete transformation. Jake became one of Sarah's strongest supporters, often defending her against newcomers who made assumptions about her capabilities. Tony started including her in conversations about technique and strategy, recognizing that her military experience brought valuable insights to their work. The crude comments and deliberate exclusions stopped entirely, replaced by the kind of professional camaraderie that Sarah had been hoping for since her first day. She was no longer the outsider trying to prove herself. She was simply Sarah Mitchell, a valued member of a construction team that had learned to appreciate strength in all its forms. 6 months later, when the community center was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, Sarah stood with her crew at the dedication ceremony. The building they had created together would serve families for generations, a lasting testament to what could be accomplished when people worked together despite their differences. As children ran through the halls that Sarah had helped build, she realized that she had found something she thought she might never have again: a sense of purpose, a place where her skills mattered, and a team that had learned to see past their preconceptions to appreciate the person she truly was. Jake approached her during the ceremony, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Thanks for not giving up on us," he said simply. Sarah shook his hand, thinking about all the battles she had fought and won throughout her life. Some had been against foreign enemies, others against the limitations that people tried to place on her dreams. This particular battle had been different, fought not with weapons, but with patience, determination, and ultimately, the courage to risk everything for people who had never accepted her. It was, she reflected, perhaps the most important victory of her entire career.